Okay, Perry's talked about it. Angel coaching staff has talked about it. Manager Phil Nevin has addressed it, and Angel fans have noticed it and discussed it. What is it? It's called depth, Jonathan. And the Angels are desperately in need of some depth. So today, we're going to define depth and we're going to give some examples of what we mean so that the Angels can have some depth next season. You're locked on with Mike and John, and this is Locked On Angels.
You are Locked On Angels, your daily Los Angeles Angels podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we thank you for making Locked On Angels your first listen of the day. Every show is free and available on all platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And while you're listening, would you give us a rate and a review? We would love that. 5 stars really helps others to find the podcast. And those watching on YouTube, you can like, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified every time a new episode drops.
It's great to have you along with us for this edition of Locked On Angels, where it's your team every day. You've got the Frisch brothers here with you, a.k.a. the Super Halo Bros. My name is John, and that's my brother Mike.
And my name is Mike, and that's my brother John. And Johnny, can we just take a moment and say congratulations to Brandon Marsh and Noah Syndergaard? They started on a team that everybody said, they might make the playoffs and maybe even the World Series. And then they lost a whole bunch in a row.
Yeah.
And then they got traded, and now they find themselves in the World Series, and they're playing the Houston Astros. And so you know that we're rooting for the Philadelphia Phillies, Jonathan.
That's right. Yeah, we're all about the Phillies here at Locked On Angels because we have those connections. And Gene Segura, Michael, who proved to be quite the player in his career. I know that we traded him to get Zach Greinke, which was a good move at the time, but that's exactly the kind of trade where you give up a player who has a ton of potential for their career for a win now kind of player like Zach Greinke. And unfortunately, the Angels did not make the playoffs in 2012, even though they had a better record than the Tigers. Because the Tigers were first in the Central. I'm still bitter about that. But let's move on to today's conversation. And that is about depth. Michael, the Angels have a very shallow situation in Anaheim. And not shallow in the sense of all of the bad ex-girlfriends, ex-boyfriends you Locked On Angels listeners have had over the years, ourselves included. Not that kind of shallow. They don't lack depth in that department. The Angels lack depth in the player department. And we have 3 examples from postseason teams who have depth and used it well this season to get to where they wanted to be. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the first example. Mike, why don't you hit us with what the Dodgers did in order to maintain depth and stay competitive in 2022?
Well, let's take a drive down the 5 freeway to Chavez Ravine, and let's talk about those Dodgers who won 111 games in the regular season, and then they got knocked out of the playoffs. But we won't bring that up because so many of my friends are Dodger fans that listen to the show, and they're still heartbroken, but we're glad that you're listening to the Angels. Here's the deal. Mookie Betts went down, got hurt mid-June, wasn't out for an incredibly long time, but was out long enough for the front office to say, hey, we needed to do something. And so they made the move for a guy named Trayce Thompson, who is Klay Thompson's brother.
That's right.
How great is that to have 2 guys that are really great in 2 separate sports? So a lot of bragging rights around the table there. So they made a move for Trayce Thompson. It was an immediate move for depth. And they didn't want to wait to see who would fill that role. And I love that the Dodgers went after a familiar face, and they made the move that was necessary to get him. They didn't wait to kind of figure it out. Andrew Friedman in the front office said, this is what we're doing. We're going to go after him. And they did. Now, Friedman did say, to his credit, that they were surprised and they got lucky because Trayce was struggling with the team he was with prior, which I think, was it the Padres, John?
So he was with the Padres. He was let go. The Tigers had him on a minor league deal in AAA. And here's the thing, Mike, he was actually crushing in AAA for the Tigers, but that never really translated to the majors for Trayce. And then the Dodgers got him for cash considerations, which is our number one favorite player, cash considerations. Right. And so that's the difference here, is that Trace was having a good time in AAA and playing very well at the time.
Yeah. And so they get him. They're familiar with him. Mm-hmm. He comes and he actually fills in really well. In fact, was pivotal as the season was ending and was actually very pivotal in the playoffs. There's just something about being on the Dodgers for Trace that he's able to turn it on where he couldn't do it anywhere else. And so if I'm Trace, I'm trying to stay there as long as I can. Now, they did consider bringing up some other prospects. I don't know if you saw this or not, but James Outman was one of the guys that they wanted to bring up. They eventually did bring him up, but they felt like he needed some more consistent at-bats in the minor leagues, which sounds really familiar. A guy named Joe Adell. We'll talk about him in a second. But John, when you compare this to the Angels, we often think about the Anthony Rendon situation. So talk about Tony Two Hips.
When Anthony Rendon went down with the wrist issue, it was shortly before the losing streak. Actually, it kind of lined up right when the losing streak was starting to begin. And so the Angels went out and got Jonathan Villar to play third base. And as we all know, that did not work out. Rather than making a move to trade for somebody and get someone who was proven at third base, you knew Anthony was going to be out the rest of the season. Right. Why did they not go after Brandon Drury on the Reds? Why did they not go after somebody who was succeeding on a bad team at third base? Instead, they went the DFA route. Now, you might say, well, even Friedman himself kind of said that Thompson's season was lucky. We could have had the same luck with Jonathan Villar. But here's the thing. Villar was DFA'd from the Cubs, who were already struggling. So when you have a guy DFA'd from a bad team versus Trace Thompson, who was crushing it in AAA for the Tigers, I think that's the biggest difference here. That's the reason why Trace Thompson succeeded and Jonathan Villar did not succeed with us. One got DFA'd. One was doing pretty well in the minors, and the Dodgers saw something in him and said, let's pick him up.
John, there's something about momentum, right? Like you look at a player and is he trending up and to the right or is he not? And in that instance, you look at Trace Thompson versus Jonathan Villar, and Trace, yes, he was in AAA, but he was crushing it. And so of course it makes sense to let's give him a shot. But Villar, you're right, had already been DFA'd, and maybe for Perry, he's already made up his mind. Like, we're not going anywhere because we're in the midst of this really difficult season. However, Villar was not the move that they needed to make because he didn't actually turn out to be somebody that was great. And then there's another Dodger example, John, and that's Walker Beuhler, who went down. His last game was June 10th. And who stepped in, John? You want to talk about this favorite player of yours?
The Heen dog, Andrew Heaney, who started the season with the Dodgers and also had an injury of his own. But by the time Walker Beuhler went down with injury, Andrew Heaney had returned. And is he Walker Buehler's level?
No.
Of course not. Right. But the Dodgers were able to figure him out, help him develop another pitch, and that made him successful. Look, the same thing happened with Clayton Kershaw. He missed most of May and most of August. But here's the thing about the Dodgers. They have an endless supply of depth and an endless supply of pitchers waiting in the wings. Listen to this. They started Mitch White during this season, and he was okay. They actually traded him to Toronto later on in the season. Ryan Papillo was also a starter. He had a few decent starts. They gave Dustin May some starts once he was back. And then they had Michael Grove get some spot starts. So even with Walker Beuhler out for the rest of the season since June and Clayton Kershaw being down with a couple of injuries in May and August, they still had Tony Gonsolin and Tyler Anderson. Like, they still have these guys in this rotation. Julio Urias. Like, they have an endless supply of pitching. So there's two takeaways here, Mike, and I think lessons to be learned. And the first one is the Dodgers identified someone in Trace Thompson who they knew very well. They got him for cash from the Tigers, and he had a breakout season. And again, you might attribute that to luck. And the thing is like we said, he was not DFA'd like VR. He was doing really well with the Tigers AAA team. Now, that doesn't always translate to the majors, but come on, it's Andrew Friedman. The guy has been running the Dodgers organization. He knows what he's doing, right? The second point I want to make here is they have a system built upon an endless supply of guys who can come up and make an impact, especially in the pitching department. You lose Walker Beuhler and Clayton Kershaw from your rotation. That's like us losing Shohei Ohtani and like one of Patrick Sandoval or Reed Detmers. I would be in full-on panic mode if it weren't for the 21 draft where we got the 19 pitchers. Because here's the thing. If we lose a starter, we are not up a creek without a paddle, right? We actually have some guys who are waiting in the wings in AA who could step up and make a spot start. And we did see that at certain points of the season. We saw Chase Silseth come up for a while. We saw Jonathan Diaz get a start. We saw Jaime Barria move from that long relief role to a start. We saw Tucker Davidson later in the season get some starts. We saw Kenny Rosenberg get some starts, right? And I know Packy Naughton's gone, but he was there. And there's one more pitcher. I'm trying to think of who it was. He's in the same vein as Packy Naughton, but oh crud, I forgot his name. I'll have to look that up. But just again, we had to deal with the same thing. And I feel like more than ever in the last 10 years, I feel confident in the pitchers who are waiting in the wings for the Angels. Now, when it comes to positional depth, that's a whole different story, and we're going to get to that in our next segment.
Yeah, coming up on Locked On Angels, we're going to talk about the Padres and how they addressed their depth issues and what the Angels can actually learn from them. But first, Locked On Angels is brought to you by our good friends at Bet Online. Check out betonline.net. It's your number one source for all your football betting info and the start of the NBA season. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game that you can find. And of course, as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information, live betting, up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games, events, including the MLB World Series, MMA, boxing, and golf. You can head to betonline.net right now or use your mobile device to learn more. Remember, BetOnline, where the game starts.
Jansen Junk. That's who I was thinking of. Jansen Junk.
There it is.
We want to thank you for making Locked On Angels your first listen of the day, and we're going to continue our conversation about depth and the postseason teams who had depth all season long. Mike, how about you talk about the team that we're rooting for in the World Series, the Philadelphia Phillies?
All right, so I'm watching the Phillies, and I'm watching how great they are, and I'm looking at their shortstop, Bryson Stott, who came up huge defensively, had a couple of clutch hits, and then they started talking about how this is Bryson's first year, and he debuted April 8th. So I'm like, well, who was the shortstop for the Phillies? And so I looked it up. Didi Gregorius.
It was
he
Didi.
Was the guy. Yeah. And I remember, like, that'd be cool if we got Didi because he had some pop in his bat, and we needed a shortstop. And I think this was like the 2020 season when we were like talking about him. But he was a starter, then got demoted. Now, Stott didn't have a great slash line. He was 234, 295, 358, and 653. So not great, right? But the move was great because it was a depth move, and they recognized who they had in the minor leagues. Yes. And then they didn't wait. And the Angels are notorious. Their history has taught us that they're notorious at waiting on guys to develop in the minor leagues to the point when they finally bring them up, they're just not good. And then they don't trade them away because they want to hang on to them, hoping that maybe they turn into something. And we have more stories like that than we do David Fletcher, right? We have more stories like that than we do Mike Trout. And Mike Trout, of course, is an anomaly. Johnny, I think that in this instance, Juan Soto would be a guy that I would say is a connection there, right? Like he probably could have come up sooner. I think that they could have used him sooner, but we always have to maybe think through, like, did he need some at bats? Would he have been the same guy if he
I feel like he needed to be part of that Trash Pandas team this season who was so successful and winning all the time. I hear your point about, like, hey, we have somebody waiting in the wings. Let's pull the trigger on him. But in Juan Soto's case, I feel like perhaps he benefited the most from this Trash Panda season because even though they went to the playoffs, he came up to the majors and he crushed it in that last month.
You know what I've noticed about being a fan versus like being a leader at my job? A leader at my job, I can be really patient, but as a
Mhm.
fan, I'm like, bring them up. Like, let's
Pick 'em
just bring
up.
them up because
Yeah.
I think, after 8 years of not being in the playoffs, we want to be in the playoffs, right? And so having Levon Soto come up was great. And here's the interesting thing about that. You and I talked a lot about this on this pod. It feels like a Joe Adele situation with Bryson
Yes.
Stott with the Phillies, right? Like Joe started with us, and then he got sent down to AAA, and
Mhm.
he crushed it, which we expected.
He
But
always
then
does.
right, but then Taylor Ward goes down, runs into a literal wall, and what do? They sign Juan LaBarfus. Like, they go and get Juan, right? I'm just glad that we can say his name again because I haven't been able to say LaBarfus in a long time.
Right,
I mean, the
right.
guy hit a buck 83. The guy was terrible. And then in the same vein, Mike Trout gets hurt, and we get Sierra, Dylan
Mhm.
Thomas, Duggar, and Harrison. And all of those
Mhm.
guys were terrible. I mean, the highest batting average out of those guys was Monte Harrison. He hit
Yeah.
182, and at least Joe Adell hit 230 on the season, right? And
Right.
I feel like more at bats for him would have been beneficial. I think that the consistent at bats that he needed, he could have gotten in the major leagues. And so I think the Angels really missed on this one, and the Phillies did a really great job. What do you think?
I think so too. And I mean, obviously, Bryson Stott has had such a huge impact on this Phillies team, and he's excitable. He's young. He's doing a great job out there. And the other thing is, Mike, like the Juan Lagares thing reminds me of the Trace Thompson move that the Dodgers did, but Juan
Yeah.
Lagares didn't have a team, and we had to
Yeah.
sign him on a minor league deal and
Right.
bring him in. And I know that he was serviceable in 21 and he played a good outfield while Trout was down and he had some moments, but it wasn't enough to convince me to bring him back. I would choose Joe Adell 120 times over Juan Lagares and his 183 batting average. I would
Right.
choose Joe Adell over Sierra and his 165. Dylan Thomas bat 091, Steven Duggar bat 053. Joe Adell was at least 230. Like,
Yeah.
give me a break. I'd rather
Yeah.
see him get the ABs and stay up with the team and learn from this experience and
Seems to
learn
make
from this
sense.
team.
Right. Yeah. That
And they
seems to
brought him
make
back
sense.
eventually, right? And he got to finish the season with the Halos, and he was starting to turn some things around. I think now that Jeremy Reed is gone, thank goodness. I know we haven't talked about that. We did tweet about it, but now that he's gone and they can have the chance to bring in another hitting coach, I am just so hopeful that they work with Joe Adell and help figure things out and not try
Yeah.
to apply a uniform cookie cutter approach to all of these hitters, but to take advantage of the unique offerings that each guy brings to the table, like Joe Adell. Joe Adell has so much potential that somebody just can't seem to unlock yet at the
Yeah.
plate. And I think it's more than there. So here's the point about this, Mike. The Angels were severely lacking in outfield depth at the time of Taylor Ward getting hurt and Mike Trout getting hurt. So instead of having Joe Adell come back up from AAA, they went out and kind of scraped the bottom of the barrel. They had some guys in AAA that were on Salt Lake that they brought up. They went out and brought back Juan Lagares, and they just didn't give Joe Adell a chance. And it's confusing to me because the ABs they wanted him to get with AAA, he could have had at the major league level. I know that you and I had a conversation prior to him being sent down that he probably needed to be sent down, but that was before Taylor Ward was hurt. That was before Mike Trout got hurt, right? And so all of that adds up to we should have taken advantage of the fact that we have Joe Adell waiting in the wings, even if we were struggling. I mean, those guys are not the answer. At
No.
least roll with the young guy who makes
Yeah.
your club better and is part of your future. And I think that's the approach that the Angels should have taken. I think Perry Minasian is going to need to address a lot of position player depth this season because, as we saw, once Trout and once Ward were hurt, we did not have a lot of options there.
So the Dodgers addressed their depth with a move to get Trace Thompson. We saw the Phillies bring up Bryson Stott. And now we're going to talk about the Padres. And they made a move via trade, which I got to be honest with you, as a fan of the Angels, watching the Padres and being in California and being able to see them every so often, I've been really impressed by their front office.
Yeah.
And they're making the trades and they're doing the things that they need to do to make their team better. And word is that they've given up some really great players. So
They've
we
gone
might
all
see
in.
them, right?
Yeah.
We might see that. But that's a part of winning, right? Like go back a couple of years. I think it was Josh Fields, I think, is who the Astros traded Yordan Alvarez for, right? Like, I think his name was Fields or something like that. Like, that's how important he was, right? We don't even know who the guy is. And the Dodgers traded Yordan to the Astros, and Yordan's become incredible, right? Like, he's the reason why they're in the right? He's the reason why they're in the World Series. And so the Padres have done the same thing, and they went and got Josh Hader, who is not a hater. He's a hater of batters, but he is somebody that I've loved watching. And they got him. He was having a great year, and then immediately he struggled with the Padres. So everybody's like, what a terrible trade. This is not good. And is his arm dead? All that stuff. But what I liked about what their organization did, in particular, what their management did, is that they didn't give up on him. And they let him continue to go out there and be who he is. And when they got to the playoffs, this guy threw over 100 miles an hour in the same inning like 3 or 4 times. And he's never done that. And now all of a sudden, the guy, you can see the excitement and the passion, and he's hyped to be in the playoffs. And so that's the big move that I think the Angels need to do for depth is to get somebody like that, because you get into the playoffs, you're going to get fired up, right? Like, this is why you play the game. And this big arm really helped them to stay in it at the end of the year, even while he was struggling, but it also helped them to advance to the NLCS. And I love that they got Hader. They did send over some arms to the Brewers, but they got a more reliable arm, and they get him for a while too, which is great. And so that's one of the moves they made. But they also did another move that was kind of a surprising move, but it was really helpful. When Tatis was down, it was like no problem for them. So talk about that.
Yeah, no Tatis, no problem, because they had Ha-Seong Kim play in at shortstop. Mike, he had 10 defensive runs saved at shortstop.
I saw that on the stats.
Season.
I was like, that's amazing. What an incredibly great defensive player. Like, that's it. Like, that's like squid numbers, except Kim actually could hit the ball.
Yeah, exactly. He had a 4.9 WAR, 11 home runs, a 251 average, 59 RBIs, a 708 OPS. Let me go back to the Hader conversation really fast.
Okay.
When the Padres traded for Hader, they sent their closer, Taylor Rogers, over to the Brewers.
Yep.
And they sent some players with Taylor Rogers to get Hader. And even though Rogers is a free agent at the end of this season, the Brewers were willing to make that trade because they wanted the players that the Padres were able to send. And again, this goes back to depth. This goes back to the fact that the Padres have made so many moves to get the players that they want, and that includes Josh Hader. That's a great example because they were able to send their closer for a better closer who's going to get them to the playoffs and help them succeed as far as they did. And then the Brewers get what they want in return with some young arms that they got back because the Padres had that depth. But
yeah,
going back to Tatis, playing shortstop, he played the outfield some. So, of course, we have Ha-Seong Kim fill in at shortstop. He does a great job this season. But then you think about the outfield where they tried Tatis a few times. They had Jurickson Profar, Trent Grisham, Will Myers, Juan Soto later came on. And they were able to make the moves for Soto, again, out of their minor league depth. They have players that they need in their system, and they use those players to go get guys like Josh Bell, Juan Soto, Brandon Drury. They needed to supplement their offense and defense. They didn't hit for a very good average this season. In fact, Manny Machado was a beast, and he had a ton of home runs. And Trent Grisham surprisingly had 17 home runs. And so you just kind of had some pop and some power, but I think they played a great defense. And here's the thing about Ha-Seong Kim is he reminds me of the kind of season that Luis Rengifo had, where you kind of have this like moment of brilliance of, oh, this guy, he's finally found it. And while Kim did well last season, he didn't play as many games as he did in 22. He played 150 games in 22, and he was around 100 mark in 21. And so they really went in on Kim to make sure that he was the guy while Tatis was out with his injury, and then he got suspended. So the Padres did all this without Tatis. Number one, because they had a player they could trust in Kim. And number two, they went out and got the pieces that they needed to supplement themselves and get them to the playoffs. It wasn't an easy task to get there, but when you can beat the Dodgers, who crushed you all season long in the playoffs, and then make it competitive. I know that the Phillies are just kind of the team of destiny right now, and I would have been cool either way with the Phillies or the Padres going to the World Series because it's a fun team that hasn't been there in a long time. And I mean, the goal is to get to the playoffs, and the Padres are doing a lot of those win now moves to get there. And the final point out of all of this conversation about the Padres, the Angels can trade out of an abundance of good pitching. Now, we talked about earlier, if a pitcher goes down, they have young pitching waiting in the wings who could come from Double-A to the majors and get us through while somebody's down. Or if you need a position player, if you need to supplement the depth on the major league roster, you go out and get a player to replace somebody who's gone down and use the abundance of good arms that you now have in your system and will be good down the road. I think that this offseason, I think Perry is going to expect more, or I think we can expect more signings from Perry rather than direct trades, but at least this time both are on the table, right?
Right. Yeah. And I agree 100%. Like, let's not just think, hey, these young guys are going to be the guys that are going to fill all the gaps. It might be wise to make those trades. The only pushback I would have with what Perry is dealing with is the finances are tight, right? Mm-hmm. You got three really big players on your roster that are taking up $100,000 of your resources.
Right.
And so I can see them going with some of the young players. This is an exciting conversation because we get to talk about those young players when in the past we really didn't have that discussion because we weren't sure what we had. Mm-hmm. But this last season has really opened our eyes to that. Chase Silseth is the name that keeps rising to the surface because I think that guy is major league ready. And I think he got all of the wiggles out this last season so that he could be major league ready in 2023.
Absolutely. Yeah. This offseason is going to be very interesting. And the approach that Perry Minasian takes has to take in the payroll into consideration and take into consideration the talent that we finally seem to have in the minor league system and take advantage of that to get the players that we need to be successful in 2023.
Well, it's these conversations about depth that help bring some clarity to what everybody means about depth. That's why Locked On Angels is here for you, and we're thankful that you made this your first listen today. And for your next listen, check out our friends at the Locked On Sports Today podcast. They share some of the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and they have the take of the day, and they're available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, let us know what you guys think by getting in our mentions on Twitter at Locked On Angels. You can reach the show there, and you can reach us at Super Halo Bros on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you there as well. Mike, what do we have on deck for tomorrow's show?
Friends, Johnny is going to be sitting in the hot seat, the GM seat.
I act like I don't know.
you played it off really well.
Thank you.
He's kicking Perry out. He's booting him out. And tomorrow, John is going to let us know what a John Frisch offseason would be like if he was the general manager of the Angels. That's tomorrow on Locked On Angels.
I really hope that you guys decide to join us for that edition of Locked On Angels. We can't wait for that. And then Mike is going to give his the next episode. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, my name is John, and that's my brother Mike.
And my name is Mike, and that's my brother Perry. I mean, that's my brother John.
That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Angels, and we will see you tomorrow.